So our second presentation looks at Trump and the Constitution through policies and appointments rather than through his own personal controversies. And one pattern of the Trump presidency, which I think is actually a fairly significant one, is that the administration had a tendency for very aggressive attempted expansions of executive power to implement Trump's agenda, but that these policies, whether by executive order or through regulations adopted by the executive branch, often were done in incredibly sloppy ways that allowed the courts to check them, often on technical grounds. And so Trump as a president was in many ways among the weakest, arguably the weakest president we've had since World War II, because he provided so many openings for the courts to just sort of push back. And a few examples of this: the first of the Trump travel bans. This is a photograph outside of JFK Terminal 4, where the international arrivals are at Kennedy. This was issued, the first of the travel bans targeting majority Muslim countries was issued very shortly after Trump took office. It was an incredibly sloppily drafted order. The work primarily of Stephen Miller, the sort of immigration hawk, close Trump advisor. The rationale for the policy wasn't particularly spelled out. It wasn't clear that, say, holders of American green cards, people who had legal residence right in the United States, who happened to be in one of these countries, maybe returning home to visit families, or maybe doing academic research, or maybe on a business trip or anything, would or would not be allowed re-entry into the United States. Because the measure was so sloppily done, courts almost immediately intervened with injunctions preventing it from being implemented. And while there will be a travel ban from Trump that ultimately will be upheld, it is not this original one because of the sloppiness in execution. Similar thing happens with the proposal to add a question to the census that would ask whether the person filling out the census was a U.S. citizen. This proposal is strongly opposed by immigrant rights groups and by Democrats, who believe that it may very well deter some voters, particularly Hispanic voters, from filling out the census, which would have effects on what the states in which they reside in terms of federal funds coming in. And the argument that immigrants' rights groups make is that this will not just deter undocumented immigrants from filling out the forms, but could deter legal citizens who were worried perhaps that there was that there would be a legal harm if they answered this question incorrectly. This made it up to the Supreme Court. The original vote appears to have been 5-4 in favor of Trump, but Chief Justice Roberts, who is concerned always about the institutional legitimacy of the court, flips sides and votes with the 4 liberals. He's able to do so, though he doesn't have to say that this question is constitutionally illegitimate, which I think would have been very, very difficult to do. Instead, he argues that the Trump Commerce Department, which has authority over the census, didn't properly follow a federal law called the Administrative Procedures Act, the APA, which governs how cabinet departments are supposed to operate when they issue new regulations. And so basically the Trump census approach is thrown out on a technicality because the administration screwed up in development. Similar with a Trump proposal to use executive authority to withhold federal funds from sanctuary cities. So these were cities who had adopted as official policy that city agencies would refuse to cooperate in any way unless ordered to do so by a court with immigration enforcement officials. Trump tries to withhold the funds, but the executive order doing so is again very sloppily drafted, and it's blocked by an appeals court in the Seventh Circuit, which is based in the Midwest, and the Supreme Court doesn't intervene. So this is one pattern of Trump, that Trump sort of speaks a big game about executive authority, but because there's a sloppiness to the execution, what he's able to get done is substantially more limited. By contrast, Trump is significant, I think, and there's a long-term significance with regards to the judiciary, where he makes 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, each of them a success from the standpoint of conservatives. So the first is Neil Gorsuch, who was appointed to the seat vacated by Justice Scalia, who had passed away in 2016, a seat to which the Democrats, President Obama, had nominated Merrick Garland, now the Attorney General, but the Senate never even considered his nomination. Even if the Senate had considered his nomination, at that point, you needed 60 votes to get confirmed to the Supreme Court. The Republicans had a 54 to 46 majority in the Senate. There was no way that 14 Republicans were going to vote in favor of Garland. So Garland really had no shot. The seat remains vacant for a year. Gorsuch replaces him. Gorsuch is a quite conservative justice, although maybe not as conservative as Scalia. The second nominee of Trump does shift the ideological balance of the court. In 2018, Justice Kennedy, the moderate swing vote, we've been talking a lot about him the last few weeks, announces his retirement, and is replaced by a former clerk of his and worked for him at the Supreme Court named Brett Kavanaugh, who also had worked for Kenneth Starr during the Clinton impeachment hearing, and then had served as a federal judge. And Kavanaugh had a reputation for being smart, ambitious, politically conservative, a safe Republican choice. During the nomination process, there are multiple allegations of sexual assault that come out against Kavanaugh. At least one group of these allegations put forth by a Democratic lawyer and a critic of Trump named Michael Avenatti were almost certainly false. But there is a compelling witness that testifies about an alleged sexual assault when they were both teenagers, named Christine Blasey Ford, who's a professor out in California. Democrats generally believe Blasey Ford. They say that it's important to believe women. Republicans generally believe Kavanaugh. They say that it's important to respect the presumption of innocence in these cases. It is largely a political decision. It's interesting that 2 years later, when a woman named Tara Reid makes a sexual assault allegation against Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential campaign, the two parties basically reverse their position on whether or not to believe. At the end of the day, the question of nominating Kavanaugh comes down to the vote of this senator, Susan Collins, a Republican from Maine. Republicans had a 51-49 majority. There are two moderate Republicans in the Senate, Collins and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. Murkowski announces that she's going to vote against Kavanaugh. If Collins votes against Kavanaugh as well, it's likely the vote's going to be 51-49 no, and his nomination is sunk. She gives a long speech, sort of 40-minute speech, in which she argues for the importance of the presumption of innocence, says that she believes that Blasey Ford was sexually assaulted, but that the specific allegations against Kavanaugh she doesn't see as proved, and so she votes in favor of Kavanaugh's confirmation. Liberal groups, Democrats, are outraged by this. Collins represents Maine, which is a blue state or bluish state. They promise to raise large amounts of money to defeat her in a state that is extremely inexpensive to advertise in. The Democratic nominee against Collins in 2020 raises more than $100 million, but Collins is nonetheless reelected by 9 points. When Collins announces that she's going to vote yes, the most conservative Democrat in the Senate, a West Virginia senator named Joe Manchin, announces that he too has decided that he's going to vote yes, and ultimately, therefore, Kavanaugh gets through with a 2-vote margin. The Kavanaugh confirmation, however, does have at least something of an effect on the 2018 midterm elections. Democratic incumbent senators in 3 red states, Indiana, Missouri, and particularly North Dakota, all announced that they will vote against Kavanaugh's confirmation. And these are states that Trump had carried easily in the 2016 campaign. And it's possible all 3 of these senators, Joe Donnelly in Indiana, Claire McCaskill in Missouri, Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, would have been defeated regardless, but the Kavanaugh vote no basically seals their fate. And Manchin, who survives by 3 points in West Virginia in what was a very, very, very Republican state, almost certainly would have been defeated as well if he had not voted in favor of Kavanaugh. So the Kavanaugh confirmation becomes a political as well as a constitutional issue. And then the last of the Trump Supreme Court nominees comes right at the end of his presidency, and the nominee here is Amy Coney Barrett, a conservative, very, very smart judge from the Seventh Circuit, which is based in Chicago, who was nominated to take the place of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had had a number of health scares over the course of her last 15 years or so of life, but had chosen not to retire from the court when Obama was president, and when Democrats had a majority of the Senate in 2013 and 2014. She passes away shortly before the 2020 election. Garland's nomination in 2016, recall the Senate Republicans had not considered it. Democrats say that the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has created a precedent that the Senate can't consider presidential Supreme Court nominations in an election year. McConnell says no, that was not his precedent. Instead, it was that the Senate would not consider the nomination of a president from the party who did not control the Senate, because Republicans have a majority in the Senate. He says he's going to move forward with Barrett, and Barrett ultimately is confirmed over the votes of two negative votes from Senate Republicans Murkowski and Susan Collins. So the Supreme Court shifts, fairly significantly, I think, to the right under Trump. One other aspect that I think is worth commenting on in the Trump nominations. Trump also tends to nominate to the appeals court. So these are the courts just below the Supreme Court. Young, very smart, and very conservative judges. The Trump nominees as a whole are much whiter than nominees under the Obama administration or thus far under the Biden administration. Diversity is a goal of, or racial and ethnic diversity is a goal of Democratic judicial nominees in a way that it really hasn't been for Republicans. But I think there is an important exception under Trump. Trump is very aggressive at nominating Asian American judges, and two of the most prominent are young judges who are appointed to the Sixth Circuit. Amul Thapar, who is South Asian and was likely the runner-up to Barrett in 2020. He would have been the first South Asian justice on the Supreme Court. And the second was Patrick Bumate, who was nominated to the Ninth Circuit, which is on the West Coast, who became the first Filipino American who has ever been nominated to an appellate court level, and he was also the first gay nominee of any of Trump's appeals court nominees. So there was this intriguing aspect of diversity that we see from Trump with regards to Asian American nominees. The number of African Americans who are nominated by Trump to the federal judiciary is almost zero. It's not something that he is particularly concerned with. His basic argument seems to be that because Black voters are overwhelmingly Democratic, he's not going to go out of his way for racially diverse nominees. And that's our second snippet.